Hi there, this is Dr. Tanner Melnick, physical therapist and running specialist here at Movement Rehab and Performance. And in this video, I'm going to discuss my own experience completing a metabolic fitness test and how the results of the test have led me to make changes in my own training. So I'm just going to give a brief update on myself. So currently I am training for a marathon that is in 7 weeks. I originally completed this test about a month ago, so it kind of fell right in the middle of my training plan originally. So my main goal for the completion of the fitness test was to gain some insight into how my training was going so far up to that point, and then also to identify areas of weaknesses within my fitness as it relates to long distance endurance running, to help refine my training a little bit for the remainder of the training plan. This was the first metabolic test that I have completed, and prior to this I've been using heart rate training pretty extensively, but all the heart rate zones were based on just my age-related norms as I've been running the past few years, and therefore they have not been personalized to me and my fitness levels. So I've essentially just been trying to kind of cross-reference or cross-check through the use of RPE primarily and some other self-checks to gauge my running intensity to try to isolate myself into the correct zone that I'm looking for. Prior to the completion of a test, I thought I had a really good idea of the various intensities that I should be running at, but based on the test, it revealed that not only did I have some weaknesses in my running, but also that my true heart rate zones fell outside of what I had previously conceived to be the correct zones. This was probably the biggest overarching takeaway from the testing, but even outside the zones, there was a lot that the testing revealed. So now I'm going to show you some examples of some of the things I learned with some of the data that was taken during the test. So I learned that my zone 2 training zone was much lower than I previously thought. So my zone 2, which is where I spend a lot of time, or I should say I try to spend a lot of time when I'm training, was lower than I thought. And so what this means is that when I thought I was training in zone 2, I was actually mostly spending time in zone 3, which is obviously not ideal. These zones offer very different benefits, and I was not getting the benefits that I was looking for out of zone 2 because obviously I wasn't there. So I was being very inefficient with my time and effort when it came to my training originally. I also learned that my top end zones were much lower than I had suspected. So my heart rate peaked at a lower number than I anticipated, which can be common in those with moderate endurance sport experience, where the heart rate max will actually slowly reduce whenever your fitness improves overall, and that's not uncommon. Zones 3, 4, and 5 were also off from what I had expected, which was where all of my faster speed work was being performed at. So due to this, I was essentially missing out on all of the benefits of training that I had expected to be receiving, and probably getting some of the time spent in the correct zone, but really missing out on a whole bunch of effective training. I also gained some insight into what my recent training had been doing in terms of changing my zones and manipulating energy systems in the body, as the testing really does a good job of reflecting your recent training, say the past 6 months or so. It can really illustrate that through the testing itself. So after looking through the data, it became really clear that my body was much more reliant on carb usage as opposed to fat usage. Certainly early on in the lower heart rate zones, I was kind of already switching over to carbs being a main fuel source, relatively quickly, versus being able to utilize that fat later on into the higher heart rate zones. So for some people this may be appropriate depending on what your training goals are, but for me with my goals, I'm trying to improve my fat burning efficiency, so I'm trying to decrease my carb utilization, particularly in the lower end running intensities. With these major insights, my goal was to make changes to the prioritized big ticket items that felt controllable, and then try to not fix everything under the sun that I identified. Okay, so now I'm going to go over some of the changes that I made and show you kind of how I implemented them within my running itself. So the first thing I did was I updated my heart rate training zones on my watch so that when I was running, I could reference the accurate zones that were identified during the testing, so that I would be able to identify whether I was in the right zone or not. The second thing I did was I placed a larger focus on my low zone training. So I really attempted to keep my easy running completely within zone 2. So I'm going to show you an example of a run that was from before the testing. So you can see, now obviously the numbers are going to be a little bit different because the zones were updated, but you can even still see with the higher heart rate numbers for the previous zones that I was still spending too much time in zone 3, which now, with those same parameters would fall, in the high end of my zone 3, even, creeping towards zone 4. So if you compare, this run to the second example that I'm going to show now, the second one is going to be, post-test, so a more recent run that I've done, and you can see how there's a much larger percentage of time that is spent in zone 2, which is, essentially what I was trying to do was, really condense and, be really strict about where my time was being spent as far as my zones were concerned. And I've also been able to do a better job about dialing in my time spent in the higher end zones to get the benefit of time spent there with the knowledge that my training zones are now accurate. So, whereas previously I was still trying to get my time in these higher end zones doing speed work and whatnot, but with the knowledge that now I'm actually in the correct zones for the correct goals that I'm targeting, it makes my time spent there a lot more efficient. The other thing that I was dealing with, especially early on in my training plan, was I actually had a small injury that prevented me from running at really high intensities, really high speeds without flaring it up. So I unfortunately wasn't able to add in a ton of speed work until more recently. So some of that probably also explains and contributes to why the test results ended up being the way that they did. But certainly now that I'm pretty much recovered from that, I'm able to push into these higher end zones with confidence. So here's how I felt since updating my training. So following the changes that I made in my training, I've noticed some real benefits already. I've noticed that my speed in zone 2 has increased while remaining at the same heart rate, which basically indicates improved efficiency. So I'm requiring less energy to run at the same speeds. So I can run, 6-7 miles an hour, whatever it might be, at the same heart rate that before I was running at, 5 miles an hour, for example. The other big change was how I have felt more holistically. So I really felt strong and fresher overall, which I think is in large part, due to the kind of more targeted training approaches. So I don't feel like I'm holding on to as much fatigue, let's say. I feel like I'm recovering better, not only within the run if I'm doing something like an interval run or something like that, but even run to run, day to day, when my frequency, I'm basically running every single day during a week. I feel like when I go out to run the next day, I feel pretty fresh and pretty good overall, which is really great. And then as I mentioned before previously, that early on in my training plan, I was dealing with this kind of nagging injury, and I had been doing other things to kind of treat, and it was certainly getting better prior to me initiating the testing and then changing my zones. But certainly that also kind of helped improve the efficiency or the speed at which I kind of recovered. So I feel like I mentioned, I was not holding on to that fatigue as much, and I felt like overall my body was recovering. And shortly thereafter, the testing was completed. My injury pretty much exclusively went away, and I was able to run my speed. I was able to run slow. I was able to run as far as I wanted without really any serious concerns as far as my injury went. And this would make sense, as previously I was spending far too much time above zone 2, therefore accumulating a lot of excess loading through my body. And as I dialed that back and got more of my zone 2 training, which is where I'm spending most of my time, kind of dialed into the right place, my overall kind of excess loading definitely decreased, which was great. These changes, even without the improvements that I saw in speed and efficiency, would have made the testing, worth it overall, and the benefits on a performance side are just basically a nice bonus, which is really great. So here's how I plan to update this going forward, into the future. So with my race, coming up in a matter of weeks, I plan to potentially do a retest, so just another test again, closer to the race, so that I can get one last update on my zones heading into the race. This will kind of help me, track the progress essentially that I have been making in the previous weeks since I took the test, and get me ready to be in the best zone possible for the race. So certainly, whenever we're talking about racing, there's kind of a very specific zone that ideally you're spending most of the time in, depending on what distance you're going. So in my case, running a marathon, that's something that you're going to need to be able to sustain for multiple hours. So being able to pinpoint exactly where my heart rate should be to sustain me over that course of the duration will be really helpful and give me an idea to help with my pacing strategy as well. So overall, I hope you found this video interesting and it gave you a good idea of how impactful completing a metabolic fitness test can be for your training. If you would like to get more information on completing a metabolic fitness test or to schedule a test, please click on the link below. And if you're curious as to what a test looks like, check out our last video. And as always, happy running.